So we're back. You can see that tonight I'm in the moth lab. There are the moth boxes. And I'm representing here my old college. So let's get started. Last time we ended with this graphic of U.S. energy supply and use. And what was really interesting about it was that we saw that about 80% of our usage comes from fossil fuels, and a trifling almost 6.5% comes from renewable resources. So we can see why the United States is annually a problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So today's talk is going to be about how we can use efficiency and conservation to change greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. The first thing we have to admit and discuss is that the fossil fuel companies are a huge part of the American economy. The fossil fuel industry and the automotive industry produce about 11% of the current GDP and about 7% of total employment in the United States. Fossil fuels have been so important and they've had such a dominating effect that they've completely remade several other industries. I mean, we can just point to farming and the manufacture of food. And in farming, we've seen the use of huge amounts of fossil fuels to create fertilizer and to drive huge machines and allow one farmer to farm tremendous acreage. Same with food items. Food items now routinely have so many petrochemicals in them, and the food industry has been changed by the use of massive amounts of cheap energy to produce processed foods. The fact that the fossil fuel economy is so important in the United States economy means that any increase in fuel prices will send a shock wave of inflationary pressure through the economic system. Our economy is dependent on fossil fuels, but it doesn't have to be, and we want to look for ways to change the economy. But just to show you how dependent our economy is on fossil fuels, I want to take you back to 1973. And the oil crisis in 1973. So an embargo and price increase by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led to shortages at the gas pump and a fourfold increase in consumer energy prices over about a 6 months period. Or at least that was the story we were told. In the aftermath, people began to get a little suspicious of what had actually happened. And investigators discovered that the actual drop in crude oil availability in the U.S. was under 1.5%. And that seemed to everybody just too insignificant a change to cause the shortages and the gas lines and the huge price increases that resulted. As a result of that observation, there were accusations that oil companies used the oil embargo as cover to increase their prices and hence their profits. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that would be an interesting thing for you to do in a history project, let's say, at some point, would be to look at that and really try to wade through all the literature. Here is what we know about it. It was very difficult to assess the actual amount of crude oil available at the time because the oil companies kept that information secret, a tightly guarded secret from the U.S. government. And yeah, I think you can see why that would be a problem. Here you have a strategic resource, and the government needs to be informed about what is going on. We also know that during this time, oil companies' profits soared by hundreds of percentage points. So this was also an indication that something wasn't quite right. Everybody suffered, but the oil companies did not. We know now from the last unit that the combustion of fossil fuels has been the primary cause of increased anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere, and that it is anthropogenic carbon that is causing the warming. And we've seen now plenty of evidence that these companies have actively subverted efforts to reduce production of greenhouse gases and the development of any sort of rational energy policy. So the question now is, how do we move forward as a country? And what I'm going to talk about today is one way to start to reduce our fossil fuel dependence is start to engage in nationwide efficiency campaigns and nationwide conservation campaigns. And we're going to discuss what those mean. Of course, renewable energy sources need to be brought online as quickly as possible. And when we get to that topic, each of you will show us which of these are most immediately available and which ones have long-term potential to be developed. So let's talk about efficiency and conservation, and that'll be the rest of today's talk. Efficiency is simply improving the use of the energy available in a given amount of fuel, so getting more out of the same amount. And conservation is reducing use, which usually means changing behaviors or changing processes that require energy. As an example, efficiency is improving miles per gallon in your car. Conservation is carpooling or taking public transportation or bicycling. Some experts consider E&C the most promising quick alternative energy source. As we have already seen, one of the key things to encouraging efficiency and conservation will be high energy prices. And you should be sure you understand why high energy prices encourage both efficiency and conservation. So let's take a look at some of the areas where we can improve efficiency and conservation. Household and commercial buildings use 74% of the electricity in the US, and much of that is used for lighting. Thus, focusing on efficiency and conservation might realize big energy savings. So we're going to look at light bulbs first. Conventional light bulbs are called incandescent bulbs, and they work as follows. They work by heating a wire, by running an electric current through a wire inside a bulb, and that bulb lacks oxygen. As that wire heats up, it emits visible light, and that's how the old incandescent bulb works. They are incredibly inefficient. They convert about 2 to 3% of the energy that they use into light. So we would like to improve the efficiency by converting more of the energy into light. In 2007, the US federal government passed a law that required certain light bulb types to produce a certain amount of light per unit of power. And they enforced this law in several phases. Ever since, industry groups have been fighting to overturn this and are having some success with the Trump administration. And we'll see where that gets us to. The big question I want to ask is, are there alternative light bulbs available? And we're going to see that on the next slide. And did the legislation work? Did it achieve its goals? And that will be in 2 and 3 slides ahead. So let's go forward. So here are the 4 light bulb types pictured on the right. The traditional incandescent bulb, it wastes a lot of energy as heat in order to create light. They last about 1 year on average. The next bulbs to come around were the improved halogen incandescent bulbs, and they use up to 30% less energy, and they can last about 3 times as long. So that was a good bulb. The problem with them is they're very hot, and they have a fire hazard. After that, we got the curly compact fluorescent bulbs, shown here at the right, and they use up to 75% less than incandescent bulbs, and they last for about 10 years. But consumers don't like them because they're slow to brighten, and they often have a colder, bluish light quality. So the latest thing are LED bulbs. LED stands for light emitting diode, and they use up to 85% less energy than traditional bulbs, and they last now up to 25 years. And they don't have those drawbacks of being slow to brighten and having the cold light quality. Did this program work? Well, here we see that the law certainly got rid of traditional incandescent bulbs. So you can see from 2010, when they made up 68% of the bulbs, to 2016, when they made up about 6% of the bulbs that were being purchased and used. And you can see that halogen incandescent, compact fluorescent, and LED have all expanded, and LED is currently in the middle of a big expansion. So yes, the law worked to change light bulb type and therefore improve efficiency. And look at this. Here we have a graphic of electricity use in households, and we see that since 2010, it has declined for the first time since before 1970. So we had 40 years of linear growth in electric use in a household, and now it's starting to go down. And one of the reasons for that are these new light bulbs. My question here, and I'm just asking you all, is this the kind of government we want more of? Is this government overreach, as you will hear it be called by many people who believe that somehow demanding energy efficient is an assault on their freedom? Next, we have appliances, and here's another case where legislation led the way. More than 40% of the total energy consumed in the US is to operate buildings, and most of that is due to appliances in the building. So, federal legislation in 1992 created the Energy Star program, which legislates the development of more energy efficient appliances. EESI, which is the Environment and Energy Study Institute, which is a nonpartisan advisory group for Congress and the Senate, estimated that in 2014 alone, Energy Star appliances prevented 300 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere and saved customers about $34 billion in electricity charges. World Resource Institute estimates that from 2014 to 2020, customers will save now $570 billion in electricity charges due to the Energy Star program. So we have more efficient appliances, customers are paying less for their energy, and so you have lots of people who are really liking this program. One of the problems with getting more efficient technologies is simply that they often cost more. Over the lifetime, the technology pays for themselves in accrued savings. So over the lifetime, you make back the money, the extra money you spent, and then you save money after that point. So it is often important to look at the payback or the break-even time, how long it is before the energy savings make up for the cost difference. And that's one of the things we're going to be interested in hearing in your reports about alternative energy sources. How long is the payback time? And my question to you is, do you think there could be government-sponsored programs that would encourage consumers to buy these despite the upfront costs? In other words, what could a government do to get consumers to purchase more expensive but more energy efficient appliances? And I'll leave that for you to think about. Buildings, energy efficiency in buildings. Many buildings are not built with regard to energy efficiency, especially old buildings, because energy was cheap. As we're going to see in the passive solar design presentation, there are many techniques that can be used to make buildings energy efficient. So I'm not going to talk much about that here. Once again, there are short-term and long-term trade-offs. The short term, you have higher costs, but in the long term, these buildings pay for themselves. One reason for this is because energy costs are usually about 30% of a company's operating budget. So if you have an efficient building that a company is in or that people are living in, over the lifetime of that building, you're going to get a big payback. On the next slide, I have several examples of projects that have improved energy efficiency with their payback time. And I just want to say that in one study that I looked at, high performance buildings, high performance meaning energy efficient buildings, they used on average 20% less energy, but they cost $3 to $5 per square foot more to build, but saved on the order of $67 per square foot over the life of the building. We want to think of ways to encourage builders and the people who are going to move into these buildings to use these more energy efficient buildings. Here are some examples I'll point out that were compiled by the textbook. Here is a post office in Nevada. 6 years after they installed energy efficient lighting, the cost of the lighting had paid itself back. Here was an aircraft assembly building in Washington State, 2 years payback for new lighting. Energy efficient lighting in a drafting area of a company in Pennsylvania, 4 years, right? And et cetera, et cetera. And one of the interesting things in this study was they found that in each of these cases, there were all these unintended benefits of the change, such as an increase in productivity with better lighting, decreased absenteeism, and higher quality work. And they attributed that to the higher quality environment. So when people invest in making the workplace a nicer place, people who are working there actually respond. I think that people who know they're working in a building that is looking at environmental issues feel much better about themselves and therefore feel much better about being there. Here's a building that I once looked at called the Omega Building in New York. It's a zero net energy building. All the energy it uses is produced on site with passive solar design and solar panels, perhaps a wind turbine or two. All right, next we want to talk about transportation. And most of the energy in conventional vehicles is wasted. The energy is lost as heat from the engine, right? You know how hot those engines are. It's lost in braking, it's lost in friction with the road, and the energy is lost in moving the mass of the car, because these cars are often massive, as this Hummer is in this comic below. Once again, EESI estimates that the available technologies that are ready right now, if they were brought in, phased in over a series of 5 to 10 years would increase energy efficiency by 40%, and that there's another additional 40% to get us up to 80% increase in efficiency with technologies that could be developed were there a concerted effort, let's say, to develop them. Looking a little more at energy efficiency in transportation, but one way to do it is to make vehicles lightweight. That means you have to make them stronger, and people are looking at stronger things such as Kevlar and plastics for the outside of the building. Gasoline hybrid engines, which I won't talk about at all right now, are also a way to increase energy efficiency. Legislation has also been very effective. The automotive companies have shown no interest in increasing MPG on their own, but will do so if it's demanded by customers or if they're required to do so by government rules. And in 2012 and again in 2016, the Obama administration introduced standards for all passenger vehicles, which said the average mileage for the vehicle fleet for each of the major car companies who sell in the United States has to be 35 miles per gallon by 2020. And then in 2016, they said it has to be 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. And this includes minivans, light trucks, SUVs. And so the idea is that your fleet has to average that. So you could have a car at 75 miles per gallon in your fleet, and that would allow you to have a truck at 35 miles per gallon. The Trump administration is trying to stop the 2025 standards from going into effect. And their reasoning for it has been roundly criticized by even the people whose research they use to support the reason for doing this. One of their claims is that it will increase traffic fatalities, and the people who are in the know say there is no evidence that this is true whatsoever. Here's a graphic that shows the history of mileage, and I think it's interesting for you to look right here and see that during the oil crises of the 70s that mileage went up because customers demanded. And then once we're in the Reagan area, they bow down, down, down. And then in the early 2000s, as talk of climate change, right, this is when Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, came out, and we see a gentle increase. And now the Obama administration, by 2012, is showing us we have to step this up. And the proposed Trump rule would leave us here. Another way that we can improve efficiency is with localized cogeneration. And cogeneration is this beautiful idea that if when you burn a fuel, you create heat, and that heat goes off as waste. So can you do something? Can you recover that heat in some way and use the waste heat? What you're doing is you're producing two useful forms of energy from the same fuel. So here's the idea. You put fuel here into a generator here, and then you generate electricity, let's say, here. But then the exhaust can be used for heating buildings. It can be used for an industrial process. It can be used to heat hot water. And it can be put into electric turbines to serve as a pre-warming mechanism for the water that's going to be boiled for an electric turbine. And I'll be talking about turbines next class. For example, many campuses have their own electricity generator, and it would be very easy for them in the future to create pipelines taking the heat here in the hot water and running it through the building's elevators. This is something the Scandinavian countries are doing all the time now, and it's been very slow to take root here. So that's it for looking at the topics I want to look at in energy efficiency. Lastly, I want to very briefly touch upon energy conservation. Energy conservation requires a change in behavior and practice. For example, you could reduce your commute length. You could use public transportation or bike to work. You could turn lights off when not in use. You could reduce the temperature on the thermostat at night. At our house, the temperature goes down to 62 degrees every night. We sleep with a lot of blankets. It goes on 10 minutes in the morning before we wake up, and we wake up to a cold house. But we're reducing our energy bill quite a bit in the long run. And basically, energy conservation is don't do energy intensive things, or at least reduce the frequency with which you do this. It seems to me we cannot expect that people will do this voluntarily. So there are a lot of ways to think about it. One way is to remove government energy subsidies that keep energy prices artificially low. allow product prices to rise, and this will cause people to use less of them. You could also charge for external costs, which is something we've been talking about in this class from the beginning, and which would increase the prices further, and it would mean people who are using the energy are paying the true cost for that energy. Here is a table that just looks at the difference between gasoline prices in 2001 and 2008 in several countries. And you can see in France and Turkey, gasoline prices were huge compared to the United States. And our gasoline prices right now are somewhere below this. So we're now 11 years later, and they're lower than this. And this table shows you that if gasoline prices went up, people would be more inclined to use other forms of transportation, which have increasing efficiencies. In other words, here it is, energy input in BTUs, which is the British thermal unit, per person per mile. And you can see that an automobile with only one driver has a very high energy input and a very low efficiency, whereas a bus has a very much better efficiency of energy use. So that's it for today. I hope that you have a feeling about energy efficiency and energy conservation and how they could be useful in decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in our country. And I hope you also understand some of the ways in which energy efficiency and conservation could be encouraged. So until next time, study hard.